going to do here for the closing session is have a couple panel discussions. And so the first panel consists of representatives of each of the breakout discussion topics. And purpose of this panel is to let you know kind of what was talked about in the other panel discussions besides the one that you were participating in. So we're going to start that by letting each panelist go ahead and introduce themselves and give their topic. And then each one will have about 4 or 5 minutes, rough or take, to summarize what they talked about in the morning. And then for the last part of the panel, I'll ask them to begin sharing some of the solutions and things that they identified to help us move forward in the afternoon discussion. So does that make sense, panelists? You understand what we're trying to do here? All right. So, culture people, are you ready?
Nice job, culture people. That was good. I have to say, I told them to cheer as if Iowa State just beat Baylor in football. So that's what that cheer was for.
That wasn't loud enough.
Well, I told them they won't be wasting it because I don't think they'll use it this weekend. And the Hawkeye fans, you have a bye this weekend, so you guys are safe. So we had the culture session. Mike Harvey was my co-captain there, and Darla Best was our note keeper. Very good job by those two, so I want to recognize them. So we spent the morning talking about culture in the department, and we took a page from the face-to-face training and talked about the toxic culture and the supportive culture. Made both long lists of both of those cultures, had good discussion. Then we came back in the afternoon and we talked about what we can do to change our culture, or what is working in our culture that we need to take forward. And it's pretty interesting. I want to hear the other 4 presenters here because we hit on a lot of their topics when we talked about culture and how their topics fit into ours. Just a couple of things. We talked about what issues and barriers do we face developing a supportive work culture. And a couple of them that stuck out in our 2 sessions was knowledge transfer and sharing. That was a common theme that kept coming through. And then be open to new concepts and thinking outside the box. So both groups really hit on those. We also had a story about throwing fat. I'll have Mark Lowe explain that sometime. So ask Mark about the throwing the fat story. That was a pretty good one. And then we talked about what does the department need to start doing to continue or be supportive in our work environments. And we took that down to the individual's level. The department can only do so much, so what can you do as an individual? A couple of those items that popped out most common were lose the victim mentality, the entitlement mentality, and it's not my job. We're one team, we need to have one focus and get this done. Also, as a part of that, we said share job knowledge and seek knowledge. Be active in seeking that knowledge. It won't just come to you if you don't go look for it. So those were a few of the things that we talked about. Had a great group, as you heard. Thank you guys. Everyone participated actively, and I'm interested to hear what the other groups have.
All right, go ahead.
Okay. My group was communication. Hey, can we hear communication? Thank you. Expected you to be louder than Troy's culture group, but that's okay. We'll work through that barrier. So we started out the morning just identifying what the barriers are with communication across the organization, and we really broke them down into about 6 different topics. And those were organizational, so how we have a very large organization and how we are structured. There's a lot of disconnect between central office and the field, or Ankeny and the DL stations, and how we overcome some of that. There's a lot of disconnect in not understanding each other's job duties, and how we can work through that. The second area was tools. So some people thought we had too many tools to communicate. Some of us thought we didn't have enough. Some of those thought they just needed redistributed. You know, how can we make those equal throughout the organization and give people the right tools that meet their job needs and their job duties. And it's not the same tool across the organization. And then expectations for communication. I thought it was really interesting that some people thought communication was not part of their job. And so we had a lot of conversation about that it is everybody's responsibility to communicate. And the amount of communication depends on what your job duty is, what your role is in the organization, at what level. But you need to tailor that communication towards what you do every day. Then people and individual differences. So when you get an organization as large as ours, you find a lot of personality differences, a lot of communication style differences, and how we can overcome that. And kind of related to that, another topic was preferences and styles in both delivering and receiving messages. So one of the things was we fall victim to using a lot of jargon, maybe being too professional, using some acronyms. Depending on where you're at in the organization, you get very technical. And so how we can tailor communication to meet the needs of our audiences. Also, we have a tendency sometimes to either say too much in our communication, so we overwhelm people and their eyes kind of glaze over, or it's not saying enough, so people don't understand what you're talking about. And then not knowing the communication. What am I supposed to get out of that? And what am I supposed to do as a follow-up? So being really clear on that. And then the final thing is training. How can we train people on best communication practices and make sure that they have resources to get that information so that they can continue to improve ongoing?
All right, my name is Garrett Peterson. I worked with Matt Haubrick and Jackie Scheman on the performance management section. Yeah,
So excited for performance management to get better than that.
our two morning sessions actually made it very easy on us. I was pleasantly surprised that we had three very strong themes that came out across both of the morning sessions. So I'll just kind of highlight those three themes in terms of what captured kind of the majority of the concerns and issues that people are seeing. The first, as you might expect, related to data and the measures that we derive from that data. A lot of people wanted to make sure that we're focusing the data that we're collecting on those things that we truly in fact need, but then also somehow balancing that against making sure that we're still trying to take into consideration those things that we may need in the future that we're not just yet aware of from a data perspective. Taking into account the availability and the timeliness of the data, making sure that everybody who needs the data can have access to it. Ideas related to having a single repository for the data, if not a single repository, at least a single location where you can go to find information about that data, some form of a catalog. Concerns related to the relevance of the data and then the relevance of the measures that we're utilizing. And then obviously quality, data quality, making sure we're focusing on quality and not just the quantity of what we're collecting and what we're measuring. So data and measures was the first key theme. The second key theme was issues related to resourcing and how we go about resourcing the implementation of performance management. A lot of people, very common concerns related to simply having an adequate staff. Our employees are already spread too thin. It'd be very challenging to implement this with the current staffing that we have in place. And then related to that, perhaps inadequate expertise among existing staff as it relates to performance measurement. Making sure that management is willing to support the necessary resources, support the acquisition of the tools that we need to implement performance management, and then perhaps automating data collection, automating analysis in order to free up more of those human resources. There was, at least in the second session, kind of an ancillary issue that seemed to relate to resourcing that came up a lot, and that was growing use of third-party resources, third-party vendors and consultants. How does that impact how we utilize our in-house resources? How does that impact how we go about measuring the activities of those third-party groups? So then the third key theme that came out across both morning sessions, and I'm going to ask Paul and management to not shoot the messenger here. I have a duty to report what I heard this morning. The third key theme was concern related to unclear department level priorities. Some thoughts related to our current vision or mission perhaps being a little too broad to provide meaning to what we do. And then as a result, having an overly broad vision or mission or priorities, making the vertical alignment that we talked about with performance management and ensuring that the outcomes that we're striving to reach at the work unit level, at the office level, division level, it's challenging to make that vertical alignment work if the higher level priorities are somewhat unclear. Again, don't shoot the messenger. Limited, at least a perception that there's limited employee level input into the definition of higher level priorities, and then a perception that certain initiatives, performance management for example, may be just kind of a flavor of the month type thing that could come and go, may not necessarily have lasting impact. So that's a summary of the performance management concerns.
My name is Scott Marler, and I'm representing the leadership group. I'm representing the leadership group. Let's hear leadership. Yeah. We had very good participation and a great bunch of folks, and I want to say a special thank you for all the participants in our sessions this morning and this afternoon. Kate Murphy and Emily Whaley were our co-facilitators. I really appreciate them helping. This morning we had 58 people in our first meeting and 51 in our second, so we had a total of 109 participants in our breakout sessions. Well, some of the statistics that I wanted to share is Leadership for Change has had a total of 575 participants since 2013, I believe in 19 classes. So that's a definite positive thing for the agency. Adapting for Change, we've had 1,800 employees go through Adapting for Change since its inception. Some of the obstacles that we mentioned in our session this morning were buy-in. That's one of the obstacles that we talked quite a bit about. Not only buy-in from staff, but also buy-in from management. One of the things we said were that we tend to be creatures of habit. We also talked about a lack of resources. This could include not only staff resources, but also time and money, so resources across the board. An obstacle that we mentioned are negative attitudes. This could be associated with peer pressure. We talked about a word that I particularly enjoyed this characterization, traditionalism. It's really a sense of, well, we just haven't done it that way before. So I thought that was a good way to describe it. There was a feeling by some that one person can't make a difference, and then we also highlighted some resistance to change. Some of the successes that we talked about this morning had to do with technology, especially as we see our communication improve. We also talked about more collaboration among employees. Even having the Leadership Development Conference, as we're here today, was viewed as a success. And then another successful component of leadership that we've been seeing, empowerment, particularly of non-supervisory staff, to help lead change, to speak their mind, and to break down some silos. So that's what we talked about this morning.
My name's David Putz, and we did the strategic planning session this morning and this afternoon. My thanks to Maria Hobbs and Kathy Mather. They were a fantastic team to work with. I want to ask participants to clap because I think you had more in one session than we did in our two combined. But I will tell you that they honestly and openly let us know what they felt related to strategic planning. As a person who supports a lot of the conversation related to strategic planning, I will tell you there's no joy in reporting that probably the number one issue was that the workforce does not know what the strategic plan is, nor its role or purpose. Second, there was a large effort when the strategic plan was first rolled out, but it appears that it's lost momentum. And one of our key issues or barriers is how do we actually keep that momentum going, especially since we've adopted a different approach of implementing a limited number of initiatives at a time. It's hard to point to a series of successes with past efforts, there were multiple initiatives we might be able to report on, but because we're targeting our effort to try to get them fully implemented, we have less to hang on to and less to point out to for successes. And then probably the last issue we discussed in the afternoon was how do we keep our workforce engaged and participating in operational planning in general, but in their role in terms of strategic planning and how it's being implemented in the department. It was a fantastic conversation, and all those who said, I'm sorry, I have to say this, it's not a problem. I appreciate the honesty. It was a really good conversation.
Okay, so for the next part of the panel discussion, I want to kind of shift gears from the morning session and start talking about the afternoon session. Now, I suspect that as we start talking about the types of solutions and ways forward on each of these issues, that there's probably going to be some overlap. So rather than go down the line and give each person another few minutes, I'm just going to call on somebody, and then we'll have the other panelists feel free to interject if you had similar things emerge from your discussion as well, and we'll have this be more like a conversation among the panelists. So I will start by calling on Andrea to share what what their group summarized in terms of the main ways forward or potential solutions that were identified in the area of communications.
Okay, wow, that's a big task there, but I think one of the biggest is just the diversity of our organization. Organizationally, we have central office staff, we have district staff, we have maintenance staff that are out in garages, and driver's license staff. So finding ways to get communication tools out there, we can't take a one-size-fits-all approach. We really need to customize to the needs of each each level of the organization and area of the organization. And sometimes that means getting extra tools in, like technology, into some of those field locations, finding ways that we can creatively use those tools, maybe dual purpose some of the tools. I know people carry iPhones or iPads, or ways that we can get communication through those, and not just think of them as a tool for this specific purpose, but how we can dual purpose those. I think that was one of the main themes.
Okay. How about some of the other panels? What would you like to share?
I got one that I think plays off of that real well in terms of sort of breaking down the specialization of things. There was a comment underneath the theme of resourcing when it comes to implementing performance management, that we need to change the mindset in terms of how we typically approach our job more as silos. If we're going to utilize our resources more efficiently, we need to change the mindset and be more willing to pool resources and not necessarily maintain this strong sense of ownership. This is mine. This is something I'm responsible for. Perhaps there's somebody else in the department that can assist, or some other area in the department where you can assist. So I think it relates a bit to that comment.
Communication was really big, and when we were talking about solutions, obviously our issues related to awareness and how to utilize it. So the tool we most often discussed or was connected to it was use of communication. But interestingly enough, they also talked about tailoring the communication. And that sometimes new school is not old school, and old school can be just as effective. So we had conversations everywhere from electronic to newspaper or newsletter formats. They really felt that it was necessary to tie the method of communication to the audience. So you get a lot of support from our group, I think, in terms of the diversification of methods.
I think we were hearing the same things in our groups, even to the point of like the old Inside magazine, where there are a lot of employees in the field who just don't have time during a typical day to log on to an iPad or to a computer to look at different sources of communication. So I think we were echoing that in our groups as well, some of those technological.
We had a great discussion about that as well, and time, and your responsibility in communication as it related to communication, but it's in many of these areas here that we're talking about, is it is a part of your job. And if so, you need to make it a priority, or at least a part of your job duties. And with that comes kind of an expectation. So where are those expectations set? Is it in your job duties that are set out in your PDQ, or is it coming from your supervisor? Is it coming from your division director? Is it coming from Paul? What are those expectations, and having those clearly defined expectations so that we know where we're setting?
As we talked about communication and culture, we kept coming back to email. And we hit on email in many different areas about how it's a useful tool, but sometimes the face-to-face communication, the dialogue, you can get a lot more accomplished in a quick time. And so we really talked about email, and then also how to manage your email. At one of the past supervisor conferences, we had a speaker talk about that, and it was brought up, maybe we need to talk about those tools again and how we can use that tool better. But the big thing was just having the dialogue and face-to-face communication, and how email was a good tool if used properly.
You know, Troy, we hit the idea of face-to-face communication as well. The phrase that was captured here was good explanation from a positive leader. There was a lot of value placed on consistency of, not only consistency of message, but the person delivering it, understanding what they were saying, not mimicking it, and taking the time to do it one-on-one or one-on group with the folks they work with. There was a lot of value tied to that kind of interaction.
What about the topic of, at the several of the sessions, there was talk about, willingness to change, willingness to take risk, try new things. I know that was a topic that came up in our conversation. Was that something that came up in the other conversations as well, in terms of specifically what could we do to help encourage people to try new things, be willing to take a risk, that sort of thing?
Well, in our group, I broke out of our normal work toward finding solutions to 3 questions, imagine that. We discussed briefly the difference between change and improvement. That going into a large group of people and telling them you want them to change is one thing, but to have them work toward a purpose or to improve requires the communication of a goal or an outcome they're supposed to work toward. So it wasn't, you need change to improve. And if we know change is hard, starting on change is perfectly logical. But the follow-up to that is we want the change to be to the betterment of the department, right, or whoever we serve. So as we develop the willingness and the ability to change and give people those tools, we also need to start developing the goals or the targets, and targets sometimes have negative connotations, but the result we want them to work toward. I think we can, as we kind of get into the change mindset, we can help people with uncertainties if we start giving them guidance as to where they could be aiming that change.
In culture, we talked about taking risk, encouraging risk, and individuals not being afraid to take that risk. And we even went as far as to saying, how often do we award failure? How do we give a reward for someone who tries something out of the box and fails? And that was one of our concepts that we talked about quite a bit in risk, is it's okay to fail, learn from that failure and understand what you can learn from that and move on. But that concept of rewarding failure was a topic that we talked about.
Yeah, we had a very similar conversation and regarding failure and what's the risk in failure. Well, it might be embarrassment. It might be a little bit of hurting your pride. Once in a while there's some resource impacts, but really it's kind of a personal impact. Nobody wants to admit that they were wrong or that they messed up. But what's the reward or the opportunity in failure? The opportunity is that you can learn something, that you can improve for the future. And what's the value for you? Is it better to not take that risk and risk being embarrassed or hurting your pride a little bit? Or is it better to take the risk and get that opportunity? So really flipping it and not seeing it as a negative thing, seeing it as a positive.
In the leadership breakout session, we did also discuss risk, and with a little bit of a different twist, which is as leaders, we can empower those around us, whether those are our employees or our coworkers, those we work with, to take those risks. And there's an element there of trust, as well as exactly what you were saying, Andrea, that, it's okay to fail. And we have to, as leaders, we have to be willing to go there with those when we have those situations. Same idea with a little bit of a different perspective.
The idea of risk actually came up between sessions this morning in a conversation. The comment was something like, we don't always do a good job of communicating our successes, but we never communicate our failures. Right? Now, why would that be important? We talked about the fact that if it's okay to fail and we never hear it and we never see it, then how can I personally feel it's okay to take that risk? So at least the people I was having the conversation with really felt that it would be okay to own up to to something that may not have worked the way we wanted it to. It's an illustration of walking the talk.
Okay, I want to maybe start to bring this to a close. Are there any of the final things you'd like to share, any of the panelists, especially regarding maybe a particular solution or idea that was thrown out that was maybe something actually you'd never heard before or was especially insightful, you thought? That wasn't on the script.
We actually had a short conversation about employee recognition, connected to encouragement and support for doing anything new, both formal and informal. So that was definitely not in our standard script, but it was definitely something the group felt would be important.
And I think with that, Dave should put in a plug. There's going to be an employee recognition survey going out here in the next few days about ways that you would like to be recognized, or what's important to you, or what helps inspire you. So I would really encourage you to take the time when you get that email to take a few minutes and fill that out and give some honest feedback.
You just stole the thunder. I told my group of 20 they were the only ones who knew that.
Sorry.
Okay, well, thank you very much, panelists. Appreciate the insights that you brought and sharing those. Let's have a round of applause for this.